Welcome to this panel where we're going to be exploring the prevalence and extent of extremism in law enforcement. My name is Katie Reisner. I'm with an organization called States United, the States United Democracy Center. We're a nonpartisan election protection organization, and I run our preventing political violence work. So in that work, we work extensively with law enforcement. And we are trying to help law enforcement in various ways connect into the election protection world. And in this new age of sort of imperiled elections, we rely extensively on law enforcement to help ensure that our polling places are safe, that our elections go through to completion, results are determined, and that essentially democracy gets to continue. And so this topic of extremism in law enforcement is one that is on my mind all the time because we rely so extensively on law enforcement. But if there are members of extremist groups in the ranks of law enforcement, then that's a challenge. So you've heard a lot about this conference being a place of solutions. This is a place where folks are coming together to get actionable solutions for a seemingly intractable problem, hate-motivated violence. And when we talk about the solution set for this problem, whether it's in the elections context or the broader sort of hate-fueled violence context, law enforcement is naturally part of that solution set. We rely on law enforcement to prevent hate-fueled violence. We rely on law enforcement to investigate and apprehend suspected perpetrators of hate-fueled violence. So that is why it is so concerning when we learn that violent extremist groups have infiltrated law enforcement, or individual officers, current or former, have undertaken acts of hate-fueled violence, just as we did in the aftermath of January 6th. When we learned that, at least as of now, 19 current or former officers have been charged, and at least 7 current or former officers have been convicted of participation in January 6th. And beyond this, bigotry and extremism are destructive forces in the ranks of law enforcement on their own. So they undermine effectiveness, reputation, and trust in the community with their law enforcement officers. Bigotry and extremism impede the morale of other officers, and indeed, as we've learned, these sources of hate can even imperil the physical safety of officers themselves. So all of this comes at a time when the role of policing in society is being intensely debated, from what to do about police killings to the rise in violent crime and what to do about that. Which is why I am so honored to introduce you to this panel. These wonderful panelists are going to present you with some empirics to help ground some of these conversations. So as the title of the panel suggests, these panelists are going to help provide some data that can help ground a conversation about extremism in law enforcement. So there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, and over 700,000 full-time law enforcement officers. So when we hear some of the numbers that we're going to hear, those are sort of the denominators to keep in mind. And as I think the folks on this panel will also share, the overwhelming majority of law enforcement officers serve their communities with honor, integrity, and respect for the oath they took to serve and protect. But nonetheless, Americans across the law enforcement agencies are not immune from the wide range of extremist ideologies that have gained traction in recent years. So with no further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Heidi Beirich, the co-founder and executive vice president and chief strategy officer of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. Heidi is a decades-long expert in extremism in the United States, formerly of the Southern Poverty Law Center. She'll give us an overview of the issue in the modern era. Dr. Ari Perliger is a professor and the director of the graduate program in security studies at the School of Criminology and Justice Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. And Ari's recent book, American Zealots Inside Right-Wing Domestic Terrorism, provides an in-depth analysis of the history and contemporary trends of the violent American far right. Dr. Perliger also trains practitioners in the FBI, CIA, and ICE, and is currently undertaking several studies on behalf of the US government in different agencies. He's going to share with us some of his recent research findings about law enforcement officers who actually do undertake acts of violent extremism. Alex Friedfeld is an investigative researcher with the ADL's Center on Extremism, where he monitors anti-government extremism with a particular focus on the militia movement and the Boogaloo movement. Alex is going to share with us findings from 2 recent ADL reports on this topic of extremism in law enforcement. And finally, but not least, Professor Vida Johnson is at Georgetown Law School, where she teaches in the criminal defense clinics. She writes about policing and criminal procedure. Professor Johnson is going to share a bit about her research that suggests that membership in an extremist group or adherence to an extremist ideology may not be the sum total of the categories we need to be looking at as we answer some of these questions. So without further ado, Heidi.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully, I guess I just hit the button. So you've already seen my name and who I am. I'm just going to give a bit of a landscape of what extremism in law enforcement looks like today. The first thing I want to say is this is not a new problem. I think a lot of people saw what happened on January 6th and thought, oh my God, we have active duty law enforcement storming the Capitol. But this is actually a bulletin that the FBI put out in 2006 warning about this exact same problem. So this has been sort of on the radar for a while. There's been a lot of criticism of the federal government and law enforcement agencies for not taking this seriously, even though we've known for a long time that this problem existed. There hasn't really been a whole lot of activity around what to do about the problem over the years. I think that has been changing quite a bit in the wake of January 6th, which was a bit of a wake-up call on that front. One thing that's interesting when law enforcement officers get involved in anti-government or white supremacist groups, they tend to target other law enforcement officers. And I think that's something that is not well understood. In the Capitol attack, of course, we had that situation because so many Capitol police were injured. But the University of Maryland did a study a few years ago and showed that about 15% of law enforcement officers who have been killed in about the 15-year period prior to that were actually killed by people who were members of far-right extremist groups. Now, for those of you who were in the plenary yesterday, this is actually data that was shown in the morning, so I'm not going to talk much about it. I just want to make the point that the place where we're seeing this problem is coming from the right. It comes in tandem with domestic terrorism rising from far-right movements. So it's not surprising that we have this problem. This is just another graphic example of how bad the far-right domestic terrorist scene is right now in comparison to other movements. And these are right-wing attacks and plots in the United States. So as this movement has grown, their efforts to recruit law enforcement officers into both anti-government militia-type groups and white supremacist groups has grown. And this is a dangerous trend because these groups are becoming more violent. We have more domestic terrorism and increasing efforts to recruit law enforcement into those movements. This is some more data by CSIS that shows the attack vector of right-wing extremists. And you'll see that one of the largest categories here is actually attacks on government installations, military, and police. So this goes back to the idea that police officers are also victim of extremist activity, not just the perpetrators when they get involved in the groups. So as domestic terrorism is growing, we've also seen over the last few years more and more information about the kinds of organizations that are trying to recruit law enforcement folks or trying to infiltrate law enforcement agencies. And the realm of organizations doing that is actually pretty widespread. So we have had instances of white supremacist groups that have been able to recruit law enforcement, and also anti-government groups like the Oath Keepers, the 3%er militias, and the main organized groups that were at the Capitol on January 6th all have had law enforcement officials connected with them, insurrectionists. So the Proud Boys, the white supremacist group, there have been law enforcement officers who have been removed from their posts for sporting Proud Boys material, Proud Boys stickers. There was even a woman affiliated with, a female police officer affiliated with the Proud Boys, which is like a very rare thing because it's a very misogynistic and claims to be all-male group. So that's an example of where we're seeing cops involved with extremist groups. We've had law enforcement officers can be targeted by the Boogaloo movement. You just heard all about that in the undercover discussion earlier. So the trend isn't changing that law enforcement is on the violent end of these movements. We've also had training materials found with extremist material. This is an article about a Portland police training, and they were using Proud Boy memes not in a negative way, which was a very, very bad situation. And then there were several members of the Oath Keepers, about a dozen or more, who were found to be doing cop trainings across the country of everything from tactical issues to why you should be concerned about Muslim groups and Muslim terrorists, which is a big problem. And some of those people were actually post-certified, meaning they had this other level of importance layered on their training. And we also have a situation in some cases, because our policies are very unclear in the United States and they're set at the level of all the 18,000 agencies that Katie was just talking about, where people are seen to be members of these kinds of extremist groups and remain in their posts. And some police departments have really good policies about this, NYPD, Austin PD, Miami PD. Many others have no policies whatsoever and no procedures to deal with extremism in policing. And so I'm just going to finish this with the fact that we now have a situation, especially in the wake of the search of Trump's resort down in Florida, where we have a lot of calls from white supremacists to attack FBI agents, calling them Gestapos, they should be lynched, and so on. And some of the same people the FBI has warned in previous bulletins may be in law enforcement and be aware of investigations and things that are going on. So it's like an aspect of this that's particularly troubling. And I just want to finish by saying these numbers are probably not huge. We don't really know, but there were quite a few law enforcement officials found on the Oath Keepers leaked membership list. But the threat, as my colleagues are going to talk about here, is pretty serious when somebody is in law enforcement and active in these groups.
Thank you. We'll go to slides at some point. Okay. So, hi everyone. It's really great to be here, and I would like to thank the conference organizer for pushing forward this great event. So the research that I'm going to talk about is a research project that it's still in its early stages. We are still engaged in the preliminary steps of the project. And nonetheless, we can already start presenting some findings, some initial findings that can provide some more comprehension and more understanding of the major trends of the phenomenon of insider threat within police organizations. I'll just say that the project is being funded by the Department of Homeland Security, but of course, everything that I'll be talking about and any kind of insights and opinions that I'll provide are just of the research team and do not represent DHS or the federal government. So when we were thinking about developing this research project and enhancing our understanding of the involvement of far-right extremism or the emergence of far-right extremism within law enforcement agencies, I think we acknowledge that currently we're talking about two forms or two types of manifestations. We're talking about long-term groups that exist for quite some time, and they are mainly engaged in disseminating their ideology within law enforcement, understanding that law enforcement personnel have unique skill set, they have unique capabilities that can be very beneficial for these kind of organizations. So we can talk about the Three Percenters, the Oath Keepers, many other anti-government groups that acknowledge that by recruiting law enforcement, they both can enhance the legitimacy of their own organization, right? But also they can actually gain access to important skills. But there's also new types of associations that are really more specifically focusing on law enforcement. And in many ways, they're trying to create new associations that are exclusively comprised of law enforcement and replace existing organizations that represent law enforcement. And in many ways, they, in my view at least, they represent a more substantial threat because they have much more access to law enforcement. They are much more rooted in the field, right? And in many ways, they were very successful in the last few years in expanding their ranks. And one of the things that really we should be concerned about is that they are not afraid to directly challenge the authority of the federal government and in some cases also state authorities. So when we were thinking about what exactly we want to understand in the context of the involvement of law enforcement in far-right activities, we really try to understand how those individuals perceive the expected gains of joining these kind of groups and being engaged in extremism, and what the expected cost or the expected sanctions. And in this context, we looked into different domains. So for example, we tried to understand if there's anything specific to their working environment, the specific police station or the specific prison that facilitate or that enhance the likelihood that they'll be involved in extremist activities. Are the specific norms in the police stations? Are those practices are tolerated? Maybe the demographic of the police precinct is have specific characteristic that makes it easier to joining these kind of groups, right? It's probably easier to joining these kind of groups in more homogeneous agencies rather than in the more diverse ones, and so on and so forth. We also looked at the specific professional characteristics of those individuals. Can we identify specific tendencies or specific trends with regard to the specific rank of the police officer, his seniority? Are people who are more veterans or more inclined to join these kind of organizations? It doesn't matter what exactly they do, right? Some of them may have, may focus on administrative work within the police organization. Some of them more focus on street work. Does that matter, right? And finally, we also want to understand if there's some specific characteristic to the way they are being mobilized. In other words, our police officers are recruited differently to extremist organizations than people who are not members of those organizations. Though these are, I guess, the main components that we were trying to better understand in order to provide actual insights about why so many of them are joining, so many police officers are joining extremist groups. So in order to answer these questions, we basically did two things. First of all, and this is something that I will not be focusing on here today, we actually doing a survey, a national survey of police stations and police departments, and try to see what are the norms, guidelines, routines, protocols that they have with regard to the involvement of their personnel in these kind of organizations. Are these people being kicked out? Are these people being referred to some training? And so on. But the thing that I'll be talking about today is another aspect of this research, which really focusing on creating some kind of a database of law enforcement officers who were involved in these kind of extremist activities. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is that we are focusing just on those who were actively involved in illegal activities, violent activities, or they basically manifested these kind of tendencies while performing their duties. So, and we explicitly decided not to get into the whole issue of membership. I know that there's a lot of stuff publishing about the number of members in different organizations. As someone who is a bit familiar with this domain, membership doesn't say a lot. You can be a member of a military organization because you paid the membership fees 15 years ago as part of some kind of a part in your military unit, and since then you haven't heard about them. You know, I worked for the military for some time. I knew a lot of people who were were oath keepers because it was part of the cultural in their unit, so they joined, but they were never really involved. So just being a member of an organization, at least for us, it's not good enough in order to identify specific individuals or someone who really internalized and is engaged in extremist activities. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm just saying that for us, at least, we were looking for something more. So that was our focus. You can see here some idea about what are the sources that we've used. We have a very comprehensive data set of hate crimes that includes more than 8,000 cases. So we basically use that in order to extract all those that include the involvement of law officers. We also used judicial proceedings, media reports, and also we looked at some social media sources. And of course, we ensure that we have at least multiple sources that can verify the data that we collected. And of course, we engage in quality control and so on. But these are the main sources that we've used. And just to give you some sense about what cases were included, so the incidents that the law enforcement was involved in needs to be part of his membership in a far-right organization or in the name of their ideology. That means that the act include specific components of bias, discrimination, or other extremist traits. He needs to be current, and most of them are current law enforcement officers, but also we looked at some veterans. In the great majority of the cases, they were actually disciplined, fired, or were charged with a crime. So we were looking for cases where it was very known, and we completely ignore all the anonymous cases just because it's extremely difficult to collect data, and also there's a lot of reliability issues. Okay, so let's see some of the initial findings that we're able to see. And again, we're just starting with the data collection. So these are preliminary findings. So just take it with a with a grain of salt. But nonetheless, we have some interesting things. So first of all, there's a perception that a lot of these incidents are occurring in rural areas, in areas that are fairly conservative, more red areas. That is actually not the case. Actually, most of those incidents are actually occurring in more urban areas, in metropolitan areas, in areas that are actually much more diverse. And there's multiple reasons for that, starting with the fact that there's more opportunities to engage in extremist, discriminatory, or even racist activities. Also, in those areas, actually, especially in the suburbs, there's much more clear clash between the various political camps. So if you're a police officer in, no offense to anyone, Northern Alabama, for example, right? There's not a lot of a culture war going on. You have much less opportunities, and in many cases, much less incentives to engage in this kind of activities. While when you're operating in a more diverse community, naturally, this tension, this political tension, political polarization that we're all familiar with, has more space to manifest itself. I'll just say as a quick note also that this is something that is in line with a broader set of data that shows that, in general, hate crimes are much more prominent in blue states, in progressive areas, and I won't get into that. There's many reasons why that's the case. And you see that that's also in line with our data in general. So most of the law enforcement are actually operating independently. Nonetheless, we're surprised that almost 40% of the cases were actually included collaboration with at least one more person, or sometimes as a group. We actually now collecting data in order to see how many of those collaborators are actually also law enforcement or not. And that can help us to understand if the reason that they're joining these groups and engaging in these kind of extreme activities is related to the culture in the workplace, in the police station itself, right? So that's some of the data that we're trying to collect. In general, what this data reflect the fact that even when you're a member of an extremist organization, most of the hate crimes that we see today are are basically perpetrated by lone actors, and in many cases with very limited link to the actual organizational infrastructure. And we see that also outside of the law enforcement domain. Yeah, so you can see that most of them are still active law enforcement. In 21% of the cases, they actually used equipment. Usually, their gun, but sometimes also other equipment such as the car and so on. Targets. So I think this is really interesting. So we see that the main targets are minorities. There's a lot of law enforcement that are involved with anti-governmental organizations. This is why the government proxies are also significant targets. What surprised me personally was the high level of attacks against LGBTQ. Because when there's an incident where law enforcement is acting against minority group, usually minority groups are more visible. When you're talking about the LGBTQ community, in many cases it's less visible. So even if they want to engage in some kind of discriminatory action against those, it's usually more difficult. It's more opportunity based. I was a bit surprised. Another thing that really concerned us is the fact that they also engage in this kind of acts against political activists, which raise another set of concern from a completely different angle. I'll be happy to elaborate about this. You can see the different types of tactics or the incidents, and you can see that direct violence is actually the most common one, and that's, of course, it's a source of concern. Let's talk a little bit about the individuals. So you can see that most of them are actually affiliated to white supremacy groups rather than anti-government. There's a very strong perception that most of them are actually, but that's not what we find. The age the range is pretty significant. What is clear that we're not talking about necessarily young people. These are not young officers in their 20s. And it makes sense. When you are young officers, you want to keep your job. You still don't have the quote-unquote tenure in your job, so you're more careful. When you are more involved, when you have some more seniority, you feel more comfortable to test the limits, right? Average time of service also 11, so it's pretty compatible with that as well. Mostly males, not surprising, and also we see that 18% of them have some military history. So this is something that lead us to some ideas about if there's something which is related to growing with these kind of law enforcement organizations that are engaged in the execution of violence, if that's something that also plays a role. And finally, 1/5 of them roughly have some disciplinary history. It's pretty low. Usually disciplinary history is actually a good prediction of the reelection of duty and so on. Maybe they're just smarter than what we expect. They know how to disguise. And in many cases, discriminatory acts are much more difficult, I guess, to identify in real time and to utilize against them disciplinary measures. So again, just wanted to give you some sense, some context about what we found. And again, I just caution all of us, this is just preliminary findings. So thank you so much. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Ari.
Yep.
And next, Alex.
Great, thanks. I actually don't need this.
Oh, okay.
Oh, good. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Alex Friedfeld. I'm an investigative researcher with the ADL Center on Extremism. And what I'd like to spend my time talking about are a couple reports that we put out recently that I think get into the scope, or talk a little bit about the scope of this issue of extremism in law enforcement, and as well as the challenges that we're facing. So the first report that I want to talk about, we put out actually last year in May. And basically what we did with that was we counted every incident where a member of law enforcement was found to be associating with or demonstrated support for an extremist movement or ideology. And we looked at a period between 2010 and May of 2021. And the reason why we did this is while we were kind of going through this process, we found that there was a lot of really good local research and reporting on a bunch of these issues. But we didn't see kind of these cases stitched together to form a national perspective. And so we tried to kind of fill that void. So we went through media reports from across the country, social media reports, public records, things like that. And we built a database, and we found 76 cases where members of law enforcement were found to be associated with extremist groups like the Oath Keepers, 3%ers, Proud Boys, white supremacists, things of that nature. And I think that number 76 is really interesting because I think at the same time, on the one hand, it's high, and at the same time, it's low. The reason why I say it's high is because the fact of the matter is, right, if there's one extremist in law enforcement, that's a problem. But at the same time, right, we know kind of based off of the general prevalence of extremism in society that likely this number is too low. And I think that speaks to issues that there are in kind of reporting extremism in the ranks, as well as an opaqueness in the system in terms of figuring out what exactly is going on with these people. So in addition to that number, there's a couple other issues that I think kind of come across when you go through the reports. And the first is the fact that almost all of the cases that we identified were reported because a member of the public recognized a symbol or a reference to an extremist group or ideology, and they took it upon themselves to go to a journalist or to post about it online. The fact of the matter is, we really just don't see law enforcement taking the initiative and reporting the incidents of extremism within their own ranks. And that's a problem, right? I mean, it's a little crazy because they're nominally privy to the same information, whether it's stickers or tattoos or decals or online posts that the public is, but they're just not reporting it. Now, it is certainly possible, right, that they are handling this behind closed doors, but that raises in itself kind of transparency issues, right, because we need that information as the public so that we can better design solutions to address this issue. The other issue is the fact of the matter that in some of these cases, we don't know the outcome. We do not know what happened, what the end result with these people were, right? So we know that in 42% of the cases we identified that they were dismissed. We know 40% of the cases that they were allowed to remain on active duty, but that still leaves 18% of these cases where we don't know what the ultimate outcome was. Eventually the reporting just kind of dried up and the police never released the information about what exactly happened. And that's a problem. And it goes beyond just kind of data, right? Data is important, but the fact of the matter is, it matters for the public that these people are policing in, the communities they're policing in, because, the public has a right to know what the end result is, especially if they remained on the force, right? They need to know what the process was, why it is that police felt it was appropriate for this individual to remain policing, even though, they had these links to extremism, so that the communities can feel safe. The second report I want to briefly kind of touch on is one that we actually put out a couple weeks ago on the Oath Keepers. So we went through the full membership lists of the 38,000 names that were in there of individuals who signed up and paid dues to the Oath Keepers, with a particular eye on identifying people holding key and sensitive positions. And as part of that process, we identified 373 people that we believe are currently serving actively in law enforcement across the country. And these positions range from patrol officers all the way up to and including chiefs and sheriffs. Now, of course, it's important to note that just because their name shows up in this database doesn't mean that they're still active Oath Keepers, and we don't know the extent to which they engaged with this ideology over the time. But at the same time, right, this is an extremist group that, since their founding in 2009, has espoused an extremist ideology. And the fact that any part of their anti-government ideology, or message rather, resonated with members of law enforcement is dangerous and unacceptable. And so obviously we are very concerned about that. So this 373 number is alarming for two reasons to me. The first being, again, right, one extremist in these ranks is too many. But the second is I think it speaks to some of the challenges we have in again, kind of determining the scope of this issue. Because, here we've got a number that is 5 times the number of active law enforcement that we identified, again, through public reporting. And that's just for one extremist group out there with, no crossover. And so what this suggests is that we're really dealing with kind of this iceberg situation, right? Where there are, a number of extremists that are identified, but likely far more that are not identified and are still out there, and that haven't been ID'd, right? And I think this speaks to major issues in our reporting mechanisms, both within police, right, as well as kind of the communication between the community and police agencies across the country. So I want to wrap up quickly by talking about some of the responses and reactions that me and my colleague got when we reached out to law enforcement agencies across the country to let them know that one of their employees showed up in this database. Because I think they kind of highlight the challenges that we're dealing with. The first is that, honestly, some people just didn't get back to us. right? And that's a problem in and of itself. We are telling them that there is an extremist, a potential extremist within their midst, and they didn't, respond, which is alarming. The second bucket are, those who thanked us, said they're going to look into it and never got back to us, right? Never followed up. And as far as we know, that there is no follow-up publicly available that we've seen. And again, I think that speaks to kind of the reporting challenges that I was just talking about. The third bucket are the individuals who did reach out and ask for more information about the Oath Keepers, often because, honestly, they didn't know who the Oath Keepers were, or they thought that, they really did believe that this was a benign, patriotic group. And these conversations were happening, over a year after the insurrection and everything that happened on that day. And I think that speaks to, again, this need for greater resources to be put towards educating law enforcement about extremist movements, about these symbols, and about what they're trying to do so that they are equipped to deal with this problem. And the last bucket, and I think probably the most alarming, is something that Heidi kind of pointed to and spoke about briefly, right, is people we talked to who understood the severity of this issue, who thanked us for flagging it for them, but then basically said, ultimately there's nothing they can really do about it because it did not violate their departmental policies. And I think it speaks to the kind of the problem that we have, that across the country we have all these police agencies operating under different standards and procedures. And when that happens, there's going to be gaps that emerge, particularly when it comes to extremism. And so my colleagues at the ADL have been working with these law enforcement agencies to try and fill those gaps across the country. But the fact of the matter is we need more resources to be dedicated to ensure that all law enforcement agencies, whether in big cities like New York or small towns in Ohio, have the tools and the procedures and the resources they need to ensure, first and foremost, right, that extremists can't even join their ranks to begin with. But if they do, that there are procedures in place to investigate and, if necessary, remove them so that they are not patrolling communities and that they're not, out there with guns and badges and wielding power in possibly dangerous ways. So I will stop there and I'll kick it over to you.
Thanks so much. Chilling stuff. My name is Vita Johnson, and I'm happy to be here with you today talking about this very important issue. So I want to start off by saying that there's a long history of racism and far-right extremism on police departments. As many of you know, some of the first police departments in the country were groups of men that organized to police the comings and goings of enslaved people. And that continued on to allowing over 3,000 Black people to be lynched, sometimes on the courthouse lawn, without any repercussions for those murderers. And we don't even have to go that far back. We know that there were white supremacist gangs in Los Angeles police departments in the 90s. We know that in Ohio, I think it was in Cleveland, there were Nazi symbols found in every single precinct there. So this is a problem that's age-old in many ways in American policing. And policing sort of enjoyed a little bit of a rehabilitation during the civil rights era, where police were seen to be enforcing some civil rights laws. So you see, a little girl being escorted by the marshals there. So there was certainly a time where police officers were seen, at least federal ones, as heroes in this story of racial reckoning. But we're going to see that, unfortunately, has not continued to be the case. My research really started in 2008. I started focusing on incidents that took place in 2008 within law enforcement. My research has mostly been targeted at explicit racial bias in policing. And I picked 2008 because that's when the news media declared, after Barack Obama was elected, that we were all post-racial. And so I wanted to really start there. So here you can see there was a Louisiana officer who was found to be a member of the KKK. There was a Philadelphia police officer who had Nazi symbols. I actually made the mistake of going on his Facebook at one point and seeing that even his dog was named after a Nazi general. He was also, it was very difficult to fire him because he didn't violate, the tattoos didn't violate their policies. But he was policing a Black Lives Matter protest when he was discovered. An Alabama police chief ended up being outed and was one of the biggest white supremacists in the country at that time. He owned a white supremacist record label. I didn't know that was a thing. Had been in a couple of documentaries on the subject, and after being fired with a lot of pressure from the community, he ended up in a neighboring police department, and for all I know, he's still a police officer. And it just continued. In 2019, a police officer in Michigan was discovered to have a framed KKK application hanging on his wall while he was showing his house. And so a prospective black couple buyers actually saw this and made a report. Like the idea that this was such an accepted thing to keep on his wall, even while showing his house, really just goes to show how immunized police officers are from serious discipline. In 2020, this was the summer that people refer to as like the racial reckoning after George Floyd was murdered by a police officer, where police officers were caught on their own body cameras sort of dreaming of a race war, really saying the most vile, terrifying things that you can imagine. So we know that there unfortunately are a number of police officers who are members of hate groups and believe in the superiority of the white race. But, it continues. We've got 2021 Torrance police officers. And then, of course, we can't forget about this year. We had a Mississippi police officer bragging about how many people he killed and using racial slurs. He was recorded by a colleague who was quitting and wanted to record him on his way out. In Atlanta, police officers were recorded on one of those Ring cameras, and they threw the Ring camera away, not realizing that they were being filmed, and using racial slurs, and in Alabama, a really vile joke about an enslaved woman circulated it was easier to just dissolve the police department than to fire the officers that were responsible. And that was all just this year. So we know this is a really significant problem, and these are just a few examples of people who really sort of acknowledge that they hold racial animus in their hearts. But we know that's not the only issue in policing around racism and far-right extremism. We've already talked about January 6th, so I won't go too far into that. But the thing I wanted to sort of talk about and build off of our previous conversations is that there are plenty of police officers who don't consider themselves to be racist or far-right extremists or members of a hate group that still are espousing those types of beliefs, not only with fellow officers, but also with the community. So my research really focused on social media posts, texting, and emails between officers, either and their colleagues or with friends and family. And so I'm just going to click through a few slides here, but you can see Black Monopoly. Each square says go to jail. A police officer in Louisiana. Oh, and I think it's sort of worth talking about this one. I mean, this is Miami, right? Like, Miami is one of the most diverse places in the world, and yet this is the kind of speech that was really commonplace amongst police officers there. This is Louisiana, and the monkey term is very, common, unfortunately, in what I saw in terms of bias. This one is really somehow one of the worst ones to me. I don't know why. This is a police officer, assistant chief in Louisiana. When your daughter's first crush is a little Negro boy, and it shows a mother drowning her own child. I mean, this is a social media post, right? Sharing it with friends, families, and sometimes the public. And so why do we care about this? Like, is it just like, wow, this seems uncomfortable? No, we worry about this because we worry that officers like that not only may try to overthrow our entire government, but are perpetrating violence against people of color in many ways in our communities. So we know that the Chicago Department of Justice report made clear that racial animus was very common in the police department there. Well, that happens to be the city with a police department with the biggest torture scandal in American history, with over 100 men who were tortured to all black to extract confessions using things like cattle prods and other really violent tools. We know that in a town called Biscayne Bay in Florida, the police chief said, all of the unsolved cases, let's pin them on black people. And that's what he did until an officer reported him. You can see a text exchange between officers that are despairing because it's raining, so they weren't going to be able to arrest as many black people on the street because there weren't going to be as many people out driving around because it was raining. So we know that people who hold these views may act on them in ways that hurt communities of color. This is the story that really worries me the most. This was an officer in Little Rock, Arkansas, who was honest during his background check when he admitted that he had attended a KKK rally as a teen. And they said, thanks for being honest, and hired him anyway. Well, he went on to kill an unarmed 15-year-old boy while on duty. And so this speaks to what a couple of people have talked about, which is finding out the discipline around these officers is very difficult. So this officer, actually, none of this was known about him until the civil suit that resulted after the death of the murder of this child. And so, I wanted to just sort of talk about that as a jumping off point today, and just sort of part with, this is just the tip of the iceberg, as others have said, right? Most officers maybe aren't as careless as to post these things online. And we know the blue wall of silence often protects officers. They are going to fear reporting their other officers because of their risk to their own safety, as well as just general affinity for one another. And so we know that we entrust police with specialized training, the ability to use force against others. And so we want really only the very best people to have that ability. Yeah, I'm looking forward to your questions, and thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much. So we have time for some questions. There's the QR code in the corner, so feel free to send the questions that way. And we can also kind of kick it old school if folks want to raise their hands, and I'll repeat the question for the folks who are streaming.
I'll try to speak loudly.
Okay.
So I just wanted to see what anybody thinks about the intentional infiltration strategy that white supremacist groups enacted, kind of beginning in the mid-'80s, really earlier than that, but primarily Tom Metzger started this infiltration strategy, Operation Appleseed. And so, some examples are Brian Houghton, who was a Philly police officer for 21 years and retired and is now training cops. He was, ironically enough, a member of the neo-Nazi band arresting officers. Chris Hassan, who was plotting to kill Democrats. He was a Navy, in the Coast Guard at the time, had been in the Army. He was also, part of that pipeline. So what do you guys, is there anything being done to look into, the results of this infiltration strategy? How much does that tie into what we're looking at here? And particularly the fact that they did this in a way to remain undercover. So, like you're saying, it's the tip of the iceberg. How deep do you think this iceberg goes?
So hopefully folks heard the question. I won't be able to capture all of it, but basically, what do the panelists think about deliberate infiltration strategies, including those launched in the mid-'80s, for white supremacist and extremist groups?
I think when you're talking about the 80s, I think it was part of a wider trend within the white supremacy movement to basically elevate the quality of the members of the movement. This is where they also approach students and more professionals and more educated. And it was not just Tom Metzger, it was also David Duke and many others. They wanted to promote what they called the clean clan that is more respectable, is more oriented towards more educated people. They also did some modifications to their rhetoric. And as part of this overall trend, they also targeted law enforcement. again, I think from my perspective, I think it's a very, there's clear operational benefits, but there's also clear symbolic benefits. When you can actually include law enforcement as part of your personnel, it really elevates the legitimacy of the organization, because these are people that in many cases are being appreciated by their communities. They are considered people who are sacrificed for their communities. So in many ways, it helps them to legitimize the organization, to gain more public support and so on. And that's mainly true also for when they recruit military people that are really are revered by the population. I just add one more thing, that it's not something that started at any point. I think there's a difference. So if we think about the 30s and the 40s, we had an entire police department in the South that were basically comprised of KKK members. The entire chapter was basically, and the mayor was also a KKK member, and in many cases the governor as well. So those movements were really entrenched within the political system, within the law enforcement. It was not something unique or that people necessarily were embarrassed about, right? It changed in the 50s and the 60s when you know, the national norms changed. But it doesn't mean that these things really disappeared. I'll just say that they're just less visible because the social sanctions are more severe, right? But so that's the way I see it, at least. Not sure if, you know.
I mean, I think you're right in general. You know, the National Alliance was big on recruiting cops. I mean, the one thing I'll add that Ari didn't add is that I think the insider threat in some ways is the most insidious part of this. I know from work I did early in my career on this, the National Alliance often wanted law enforcement, not necessarily for the prestige issues that you talked about, but because they had access to information about cases. They had access to who owns this license plate and what's this driver license number. Yeah, and I don't think that's to be undercounted. And, you know, I feel like the situation, I actually feel like the situation is worse now than it was, say, 10 years ago, and that we're an upswing to a situation that's more going along the lines of eras when this was a more critical problem. And in some ways, the Oath Keeper leaks and January 6th and whatnot have just sort of ripped back the veil on what Vita showed, all these incidents and pieces. The other thing about it, though, is, you know, there's a ton of publishing and journalism of just flat out racist cops, like what Vita was showing. Racist Facebook pages. You know, the head of the Border Patrol was on one of these things bashing immigrants. Thousands and thousands of posts. And I think, I hope I don't get this wrong, that it's either ProPublica or Reveal did one of these big research projects.
Plainview Project.
Yeah, and tried to follow up with the police departments. And most of the police departments were basically like, you know, like what you described, Alex. Thank you for your information and whatever. And that, to me, is troubling, and that landscape of policies, in a way, the way the U.S. works, allows this stuff to go on because of the system that we have that's not working well.
I'll just say, if you're talking about solutions, so one of the things that we did, and we published that 2 years ago, we actually showed that there's a direct correlation between the level of diversity within the police force and level of reporting on hate crimes. And we looked into more than 3,000 stations all over the country. And if we want to improve the situations, one of the most clear and obvious things is increased diversity within those police forces. Because it's really encouraged more trust from the public and more reporting. And if there's more reporting, eventually it spills over also to more reporting about what police officers do, right? If they engage in these kind of behaviors.
So I'm just going to exercise moderator privilege for one moment to ask a question of you all. I'm reminded of the sort of allegory of the economist looking for his glasses under the lamp. And someone asked him, so did you lose your glasses here? And he goes, no, I lost them over there. And he said, well, why are you looking under this lamp? And he said, because this is where the light is. And I think that that's, you know, sort of so true and bedeviling for any data-driven exercise, is that you are limited to the data sets that you have. You're limited to where the light is. And so I would ask each of the panelists, what's a data set that you wish you had to enrich your understanding, all of our understanding of the extensivity and prevalence of this issue?
Well, I wish all this anecdotal evidence was in one place. It would at least give us some sense of what we know. In a way, Ari's starting to collect a more sophisticated version of that. But the fact that there isn't one place where you can go to find people who've been removed from their positions because they're in extremist movements, and like why would be nice as well is a bit of a travesty. And as Vita pointed out, you often find these people jumping from one police department to another. I remember when I was at the Southern Poverty Law Center, there was a guy who was going to Klan meetings and was in some small community in northeastern Louisiana, left, was basically forced out, and then popped up a few months later, like down the road. That kind of thing should not be allowed to happen.
I think complaints about police. The community knows who these troubling officers are, right? But they're in almost every state. Those are not publicly available. But police officers work for us. They're public servants. We pay their salaries. Yet we don't have access to how well they're doing in those roles. And to me, that's the thing I'd most want to see is each police department see what the complaints about them are, whether they're sustained or not. You want to know who's getting the most complaints.
Well, you also make me think of civilian oversight, right?
Right.
Which I actually think it's much easier today to collect this kind of information. I'll just say that I'll be the optimist in the room. We did tremendous progress in the last 10 years. When I started working on far-right extremism in 2012-ish, where nobody really cared about it at that time, there was no real good data about it. So we had to build our own database. I'll just say that the government itself now, because the government acknowledges the limitation of its own data, actually comes to us now these days and give us the money to collect the data. And there's Bill and others who knows that the government knows that they need to eventually to come to us because they understand that we probably have a better approach. If you're talking, for example, about the FBI crime statistics or the unified crime reports, these are based on self-reporting. I think the last data show that less than 40% of police stations actually report, right? So it's a very partial data. But I do think that both nonprofit, both academic organizations, and both many think tanks did substantial progress in terms of data collection, and the government itself is willing to transfer more and more resources to organizations that collect data. So when I'm looking at what the situation was 2012 and what it is now, it's like new people who come into the field and want to really do research have way more data available than what they had just 10 years ago. It's a completely different landscape these days.
And I'd say just as a complement to Vita's point, right, it's not just community complaints about law enforcement, it's law enforcement complaints about law enforcement. Those internal records would be incredibly useful to have of people reporting, other people, their colleagues. Because the fact of the matter is we did have cases where we reached out to law enforcement and they're like, oh yeah, that guy, like we knew about him, this totally tracks. So usually they know the bad apples, they know the people with problematic beliefs and extremist beliefs within their ranks. But for a variety of reasons, it often isn't acted upon.
So I'll just say that, and that will be my last comment, just that one of the things that we're doing right now, we're actually looking at social media of communities and see what the communities actually, we actually examining the discourse of the community about law enforcement. So for example, we try to identify if after specific events, the community is expressing more trust or less trust, or if the community also identifies specific practices of law enforcement that they are concerned about. So we're trying to see if there's some kind of a correlation between the level of reporting and what the community thinks about law enforcement. And today it's easier to do because the community has its own online platforms where the people can express their views about law enforcement. So we actually have now access to this kind of data.
I see a question over here.
One comment and then one question. I guess on the kind of making the reporting transparent about violent complaints, it always worries me because I think sometimes it can be a deterrent to reporting. People don't want their out there, especially maybe in law enforcement, if they report to an officer. Just curious about that. And I was so struck by it's almost all men. I shouldn't be that surprised by that, right? But what are the current statistics on women in law enforcement? Has there been a dramatic uptick over the last 20, 30 years of getting more women in law enforcement? And is that part of it?
I can answer that. The last time I looked, it was.
So we had a question about does encouraging the availability of community complaints about law enforcement, does that in a way deter the complaint process because then people's identifying information will be out there in conjunction with reporting on a police officer?
Because I think my question
I don't think it's gone up appreciably. The last data point I heard was that about 13% of police officers are women, and many of them are not out in the field. But we know that having even just one woman on a scene reduces the chance of violence. So it's certainly something that if I was a police chief, I'd be looking to do right now, is hire more women.
I'm seeing a question in from the QR code. Do folks have thoughts on whether and on how extremism may result from burnout or lack of community support for police officers?
So, the data shows that that most of those police officers that are involved in these kind of incidents are actually fairly veteran, fairly senior, people that spend quite some time. So it's an indirect evidence basically, but that can give us at least some indications that it may be related to burnout. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done in general, looking at workplace environment and the specific norms and practices that are in place, and to see how they impact, how they facilitate potential these kind of behaviors, or their potential to mitigate these kind of behaviors as well.
I'll just note too that there's some evidence that people become more political as they age, and so one explanation for that might be that they have more conservative viewpoints or more us against them viewpoints as they age than they did. Think of who you were politically in your 20s versus who you become in your 40s. It's often pretty different.
All right, I see one hand back there that I'll take a question from.
Allie, that's that great Oath Keepers book. You owe me a commission for recommending it a zillion times. And by the way, also, Riverside County, one of the things I'm looking at, we have an Oath Keeper sheriff. I mean, the head guy. And got reelected. Counted 4 hate crimes in 2020. But I'm going to ask you something that we're very concerned about, and that is certain states like Montana, Texas, where the bar for doing post-trainings is very low. Remember we had that FBI who was teaching how to hate Muslims? What would you say we should do at a state level to make sure that these ne'er-do-wells who are not qualified, but they may have a law enforcement pedigree, go in and get post-credits to line officers who are training them on bigotry or provisions of the Constitution that don't exist?
So the question concerns something that's been reported on a fair amount, which is that the folks who are then licensed and credentialed to perform police officer training, some of these folks have themselves been identified as having extremist affiliations, ideologies. And so what are things that could be done at the state level? I would also say what could be done at the federal level to address the appearance of police officer trainers who themselves are teaching extremist ideology, white supremacy, et cetera.
I think Brian's asking a very important question, actually. And I think post is, even in the where it's weaker, is one of the answers to this problem, because the post certification process should not allow people who are involved in extremist activities, bigoted, racist, whatever the deal is, to be involved in the training process. There's another corollary to this that is also a possible solution here, which is frankly the way police police agencies are insured. Insurers are becoming less willing to pick up the cost for racist policing, basically, and the settlements are involved. Like in Maricopa County, when Joe Arpaio was sheriff, the amount of money that the taxpayers picked up to pay for the violations in his prisons, and it was just horrific. So there might be like a combination, given we have 18,000 agencies and it's hard to sort this out, these are tactics that may make things better.
Yeah, I'm very pessimistic about the impact of any kind of training to change value-driven behaviors. I think we have abundance of research that shows that what really impacts people's behaviors in whatever setting is actually the climate, the normative climate, the work climate, the leadership cues, rather than if they went through some specific 3 hours of training at some point during their career. We see that in schools, where we see that students' support for democratic values are really more driven by how much the school implement these kind of practices, rather than if they get civic education classes. Civic education classes actually have very limited impact. And that's also through in professional organizations. Really, the climate of the organization and the leadership has substantially more impact than once in a year, training. And we see that also in other domains, right? Whether it's sexual harassment training and so on. It's eventually, if you really want to change value-driven behaviors, you really need to change the entire setting of the organization. You cannot just rely on some kind of a training. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do them, but putting our, assuming that will solve the problem, I'm not there. Sorry.
I just want to clarify, I want to keep bad guys from doing any training.
Sure.
I don't disagree with what you're saying though, about the culture.
Sure.
And with that, please join me in thanking our panelists.